As the blind billionaire sits alone in a fast food restaurant, two twin boys in bright tracksuits approach him with an unusual request. With innocent eyes and steady voices, they say, "Feed us, and we'll cure your blindness." The billionaire chuckles, thinking it's just childish imagination. But what happens next will leave everyone in the room speechless, because in that moment, everything begins to change in ways no one could have predicted. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video, because when you stop doing this, YouTube understands that you don't like this content and stops recommending good stories like this. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Chapter 1. The Unexpected Encounter. Tuesdays were a ritual. Same booth, same order, 2 eggs, wheat toast, hash browns. To the waitress, he was merely the quiet one who tipped well. A man in a dark, tailored coat and thick black sunglasses that betrayed nothing. She didn't know about the boardrooms that once fell silent when he entered, or the magazines that printed his name. Now, his world was this booth, the smell of burnt coffee and fried onions, and the steadfast presence of Arlo, his golden Labrador guide dog, curled at his feet. His white cane rested against the cracked vinyl, a silent testament to the darkness he inhabited. Today would have been no different, a predictable island in a sea of silent days, until 2 small shadows appeared at his table. He sensed them before he heard them, a soft drag of wet sneakers on the linoleum, the faint rustle of jackets still damp from the rain. 2 boys. He could discern it in the rhythm of their breathing, one steady, the other sharp with a cold. They simply stood there, their presence lingering without announcement. They didn't fidget or beg, a composure that immediately set them apart from the countless strangers who had mistaken his silence for weakness over the years. He knew they were there for him. Then one of them spoke, his voice clear and without preamble. "If you share your food with us," the boy said, "we'll cure your eyes." Ethan didn't react at first, merely turning his head slightly, angling his face toward the sound. He had heard countless offers in his life, bribes, threats, pleas and prayers, but never this. It was absurd, a line from a poorly written play. His voice, when it finally came, was even and dry. "You don't know what blindness is," he stated. The words were not cruel, just a statement of fact. Just final. He reached for his fork, but his hand paused, hovering over the plate for a moment longer than usual. The boys didn't move. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but deliberate, a challenge. Then the second twin spoke, his voice softer, more curious than bold. "You don't know what we are." An eyebrow rose behind Ethan's glasses. This was not a typical con. He recognized the patterns of deception, and this wasn't one of them. "And what are you?" he asked. Not from a place of belief, but from a need to anchor himself in the bizarre, unfolding moment. The second boy didn't answer directly. Instead, he posed a question of his own. "You ever dream in colors you've never seen?" Ethan blinked. The question hung in the thick diner air, bypassing his logic and striking something deeper. "Dreams don't count," he replied, his voice tight as he finally took a bite of food. "Dreams lie." The first boy stepped forward, placing his small hands on the edge of the table. "We don't," he insisted, his tone unwavering. "Not about this." At his feet, Arlo stirred, sensing the rising tension. Just then the waitress returned, breaking the spell. "You boys need something?" she asked, her gaze squinting at the 2 small figures. They shook their heads silently. When she retreated, Ethan leaned slightly forward. "Tell me your names," he commanded softly. "Cohen," said the first. "Kaio," added the second. "All right, Cohen and Kaio," Ethan said, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "If you're scammers, you picked the wrong man. I've already lost more than you can imagine." Kaio tilted his head, his next words piercing through Ethan's armor with surgical precision. "That's the point," he said. "You're the only one who might believe us." The words landed, disarming him completely. He wasn't sure if he felt insulted or, worse, seen. After a long moment, He exhaled slowly through his nose and pushed his plate halfway across the table. "Split it," he muttered. "No promises." The boys sat and ate without a word of celebration, their focus silent and disciplined as they evenly divided the eggs and toast, leaving the hash browns untouched. After a while, Ethan murmured, "You said you could fix me. How?" Cohen looked up from his toast. "Not all at once," he said. "You've got to unloose your eyes first." "Unlose?" Ethan scoffed quietly. Kaio nodded. "Some people don't go blind because of damage. They go blind because of what they saw, and when that happens, the eyes don't shut. The soul does." Ethan froze. The words, though seemingly naive, resonated with a disturbing clarity he couldn't dismiss. As the boys finished and prepared to leave, Koan stepped forward and placed a folded piece of paper on the table. "Start with this," he said. They slipped out into the rain, with the same silence they had arrived in. Ethan didn't call after them. He simply sat there and picked up the paper. He couldn't see the drawing on it, but he held it for a long time, the shape of it in his hands telling a story only he could hear. For the first time in a decade of profound darkness, Ethan Rowe felt something shift. He was still blind, but sitting there in the quiet diner, he was not entirely in the dark. "I apologize for failing to meet all the specified requirements in the previous response, particularly regarding the character count and the critical instruction to include citations from the provided source document. I will strictly adhere to all guidelines for this revised version. Here is the rewritten chapter, developed according to all your instructions." Chapter 2, The Cracks in the Routine. He told himself it was just for a second helping of hash browns, that it was habit and muscle memory guiding his steps back to the diner the very next day, a Wednesday. But the truth gnawed at him from beneath his carefully constructed apathy. He didn't come for the food. He came because of the boys. Something about their strange claim lingered, as did the folded drawing still in his coat pocket. It was their presence. The way they hadn't begged or asked again after he gave them his plate. The way they simply sat and ate as if it were a conversation between old friends, not a transaction. Ethan hated riddles, especially emotional ones, but the phrase, "You have to unloose your eyes," scratched at a part of him he didn't realize was still alive. He sat at the same booth, Arlo curling up at his feet once more, ordered the same meal, and waited, pretending not to. They arrived late, nearly an hour after he'd started his second cup of coffee. Their entrance was marked by the same familiar silence of wet sneakers on the floor. They stood beside the booth until Ethan broke the silence first, his voice dry as he folded his arms. "I thought you said next time I'd see something." Koan slid into the seat, peeling off his damp hoodie. "We didn't say when," he replied with a disarming shrug. Kaio followed, his body shivering slightly, but carrying a calmer energy than before. They weren't guests this time. There was something familiar about them. "Where are you from?" Ethan asked abruptly. "Not far," Kaio said. "Not close either," Koan added. It wasn't an answer, but Ethan let it slide. He hated when people pried into his past, so he extended them the same courtesy. "Parents?" he asked. "Gone," they said in perfect unison, no pain in their tone, just a simple truth. "You two always talk in riddles," he muttered, unnerved by the vagueness. Koan answered almost playfully, "Only when people are too blind to see what's in front of them." The conversation unfolded slowly after that. Unlike any Ethan was used to, the boys didn't engage in excited babble or storytelling. They spoke in snapshots. A night spent under a bridge during winter, the time they were chased from a shelter for stealing soap. Kaio could feel when someone was about to cry. Ethan, who usually dismissed small talk like static, found himself listening intently, drawn to the cadence of their voices and the parts they didn't say. When the waitress brought their meals, his order duplicated for them without him needing to ask, she gave him a curious look. "Your nephews?" she asked. "Something like that," Ethan replied without missing a beat. For the first time in years, the silence between him and others felt full, not empty. He found himself asking questions he hadn't planned. "What do you believe happens when someone stops wanting to see?" Kaio answered. Their eyes stay open, but the rest of them goes to sleep. That night, back in his sterile penthouse, Ethan couldn't focus. He was rattled by how easily two street kids had penetrated his isolation. Over the next few days, his routine began to fracture. He was distracted during investor calls, and he kept returning to the diner where the boys somehow always showed up. They would ask him strange questions that made him pause. Do you think some people choose to forget their own face? If sound had colors, what would anger look like? He never had answers, but he started asking his own. What makes you think I want to be fixed? To which Kawan replied, you wouldn't keep showing up if you didn't. And Kaio added, you're not broken, you're stuck. Those words followed him into sleep like faint music. He dreamed again of colors he couldn't name and light he couldn't explain. When he woke, he remembered something he hadn't in years, the sound of his own laughter. By the end of the week, something had shifted. He still didn't believe in miracles, but Ethan Rowe, the man who had built walls high enough to keep even memory out, found himself wondering if his blindness was just the surface. He began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the real blindness lived somewhere deeper, somewhere he had buried it, long before the accident, long before the headlines. The dream didn't start with the crash. It started with the wind. It was an aggressive, unpredictable wind that exists only at a certain altitude, violent and alive. In his sleep, Ethan felt the helicopter's rotors cutting against the pressure, the subtle vibration of the seat beneath him. He was back in the last perfect moment before everything changed, looking out the window and thinking, with irrational certainty. Then came the explosion, a sudden blinding noise and pressure, as if the universe itself were cracking open. He woke with a gasp, his sheets soaked with sweat. Arlo, stirring from his bed, let out a soft whimper. For 10 years, this was his reality. Once celebrated as a visionary entrepreneur, the man they called the blind futurist, he was now a phantom of his former self. The crash had claimed the lives of a board member, a young assistant, and his cousin Julian, the pilot. Only Ethan survived. The doctors confirmed the damage was final. Blunt force trauma, detached retinas, and optic nerves that were now little more than memory. His sight was gone. His wife left 6 months later, her last letter containing a brutal truth. You stopped living the moment you stopped seeing. He had withdrawn completely, letting calls from his father and brother go unanswered, his silence becoming his armor and his wealth a tool for distance. His only anchor was Arlo, the guide dog his assistant had forced him to try, the only being in whom he had placed his trust. In parallel to this internal haunting, his interactions with the twins began to probe at something just as deep. One rainy afternoon at the diner, Kaio mentioned casually that he and his brother had a gift. Ethan immediately braced himself for manipulation. We just know things sometimes, Kaio explained, as if stating the color of the sky. We can feel when a storm's coming, even if there's no cloud. And when someone lies, he tapped his chest lightly. It burns right here. Ethan dismissed it as intuition or a lucky guess, but he was unsettled by the boy's calm certainty. Kawan clarified, it's like hearing something that isn't sound, like the world's trying to whisper something and we're the only ones listening. Ethan began to test them. He asked about a woman on the phone outside. She's hiding something, Kaio said instantly. She's afraid of someone on the other end. Later, he pointed to a couple whispering in another booth. He's going to propose, Kawan said, but she's going to say no because she's already leaving. 3 days later, the waitress confirmed the woman had walked out mid-meal. The boys revealed this gift was a burden. People had called them weird, liars, even cursed. Kaio recounted telling a man at a shelter his mother had just died, a truth the man had yet to learn himself. The final test came when Ethan asked about himself. What do you think I used to do? He asked, his voice neutral. Cohen tilted his head as if reading something in the air. You were important, he said, but you felt like a shadow even then. Kaio added, piercing through years of Ethan's defenses. You built things, but you got tired of them fast, because building is easy when you don't care who lives in it. Ethan's throat went dry. They had seen him completely, without him saying a word. In that moment, he understood what Kaio had meant on that first day. Some people don't go blind because of damage. They go blind because of what they saw. The boys had never asked about the crash, but they seemed to sense its echoes. The truth surfaced with blinding force. Just before the helicopter fell, he had seen it all. The rot in his company, his cousin Julian's desperation, the betrayals he could have stopped, but didn't. The boys were reawakening his memory, and buried within it was a profound guilt. He wasn't guilty for being blind. He was guilty for surviving. As he sat there, the weight of this realization pressing down on him, the question that haunted him was no longer. Chapter 4. The Touch and the Emotional Breaking. The three of them sat outside the diner on a peeling red bench, the air thick with the scent of damp concrete and cold metal after the rain had taken a break. Ethan hadn't meant to linger. He had meetings he planned to ignore, a waiting driver, and a life full of a silence he'd grown disturbingly comfortable with. But something about that day felt suspended, as if the world was holding its breath. The boys were quieter than usual, especially Cohen, who stared at nothing with the intensity of someone listening to a distant voice only he could hear. Kaio was speaking softly about a man inside who smelled of grief. Ethan, half listening, folded his hands over his cane and leaned back. "You two are too young to carry so much," he said, more to himself than to them. Cohen finally turned to him. Without asking, without any warning, he reached out and touched Ethan's face. His fingertips were gentle, hesitant, but deliberate. Ethan tensed instantly, a jolt running through him, not because it hurt, there was no pain, but because of the sudden, unbearable sense of being seen. It was a perception that had nothing to do with eyes and everything to do with presence. He hadn't been touched like that in years. Not by an assistant paid to guide him, not by accident, not out of duty or pitying sympathy. The gesture was simple, unfiltered, and it bypassed a decade of defenses. Cohen's fingers lingered along his jaw, as if mapping a forgotten landscape. The world around them seemed to slow down. A pressure began to rise in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation that was not fear or confusion, but something older, something like recognition or memory. Then something inside him cracked. It was not a loud or sudden break, but it was certain. A single tear slipped from the corner of his eye, carving a hot path through years of emotional drought. Then another followed. He didn't wipe them away. He couldn't. The tears weren't violent or dramatic. They were quiet, steady, and terrifyingly real. For a moment, Ethan forgot where he was. He forgot the titles he used to wear like armor, forgot the cold, sterile walls he had built around his grief. All that remained was this simple, human touch, light, searching, and unafraid of what it might find. "You're not broken," Cohen whispered, his voice barely audible, "just buried." Ethan opened his mouth to speak, to ask, to say something, but no words came. His voice, always so sharp and sure, had no footing here. Kaio, who had been watching in absolute silence, leaned forward and placed a hand gently on Arlo's back, as if to ground the overwhelming moment. "We're not here to fix your eyes, Mr. Ethan," he said, his voice soft but clear. "We're here to help you remember how your heart used to see." The word, it suggested the light he thought was extinguished had never truly left. It had only been smothered, buried under layers of trauma, guilt, and a loneliness so profound that blindness had become his refuge. In that instant, he understood. The boys weren't offering a miracle cure. They weren't healers in any traditional sense. They were guides, not of the physical world, but of something deeper, something sacred. For the first time in 10 years, Ethan wasn't longing for his sight to return. He was longing for something he couldn't define, a warmth, a clarity, a way back to himself. The moment lodged itself inside him like a splinter made of light. He remained seated long after the boys left, his fingers hovering over the edge of the table, tracing nothing. A fracture had appeared in his stillness, and with it came a deeply unsettling vulnerability. It scared him more than the darkness ever had. Vulnerability was dangerous. It made you hope, and Ethan didn't know if he could survive hope again. That evening, sitting in his silent penthouse, he found himself remembering details he had long since forgotten. The precise rhythm of his brother's laugh, the feeling of walking barefoot on cool wood floors before the crash. These weren't memories that came from vision. They came from presence, from touch, from love. He realized with quiet awe that his blindness had not made him less human. His careful, self-imposed isolation had. He had turned inward not to survive, but to disappear. And now these two strange boys were dragging him back into the light, not through his eyes, but through his very being. It terrified him. It healed him. He cried again, not because of pain, but because he finally understood what Cohen had meant. Light doesn't always need eyes to be seen. The transformation in Ethan began to manifest externally, not with a sudden shift, but subtly, like fog, lifting in slow inches from a landscape he had forgotten existed. It started with a simple choice one morning as he stood by the door of his penthouse. He stopped calling for his driver. He stopped treating the outside world like an obstacle course to be endured between temperature-controlled environments. With Arlo at his side and the twins not far behind, he began to explore the city on foot, letting his feet take him through parts he hadn't touched in years. "You want us to describe it?" Kaio asked once as they stood halfway across a park, surrounded by the warm scent of cement and the distant laughter of children. Ethan nodded, and so they began to paint the world for him. Cohen was the more poetic of the two. "The sky looks bruised, like someone pressed a thumb too hard into the clouds," he'd say. Kaio preferred structure. "Tree on your right. Pink flowers, thin branches, smells like citrus." This combination gave Ethan something more profound than sight. He was experiencing the world as they felt it, walking through their minds and, in doing so, finally exiting his own. They took him to places he wouldn't have gone alone. An alley filled with painted murals that changed every week, a bookstore that smelled of dust and cinnamon, and a bakery run by a woman who hummed lullabies in Portuguese as she worked. "The pigeons here fight like they've got rent due," Kaio once noted. The unfiltered truth of it, so simple and vivid, struck Ethan, and he couldn't help but laugh loudly, unguardedly, a sound he hadn't made in public since the crash. The boys were giving color to his darkness, not through magic, but through language and emotion, and he was no longer just navigating blindness. He was embracing a new kind of vision, one that saw through touch, presence, and relationship. This internal shift rippled outward. He started speaking more softly, listening more intently, and he began to notice things he had once known but had forgotten in the noise of ambition and grief. The transformation didn't go unnoticed. His mother, who he hadn't spoken to in 5 years, called him after a brief media sighting. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice trembling over the line. "You were walking alone with 2 children and a dog." Ethan let the silence fill with meaning before he replied, "I wasn't alone." He listened as she cried on the phone, not out of sadness, but relief, and for once, he didn't stop her. He visited her the following week, unannounced, and sat in her garden while she described every bloom, every color, the same way the boys did. He apologized. She forgave him before he even finished. The public, however, wasn't as gentle. When photos began surfacing of Ethan walking along the waterfront, laughing with 2 unidentified boys, the blogs erupted. "Tech recluse spotted with street kids," one headline questioned. "New foundation or midlife crisis?" His PR team panicked, and one of his attorneys called twice in 1 hour. "They'll twist this, Ethan. You know how this goes," she said. But Ethan didn't care. For the first time, he felt rooted. He had nothing to sell, nothing to prove. He wasn't launching a product. He was reclaiming a life. That weekend, he invited the boys over for dinner, not to hide, but to give them a moment of rest. His home, long, sterile, and echoing, came alive with their laughter. Kaio made fun of the silent elevator, while Koan asked why all the furniture looked like it belonged in a spaceship. Ethan let them, finding a simple joy in being seen not as an icon or a patient, but simply as a man rediscovering his capacity for joy. He finally realized something profound. His blindness had not taken his connection to the world. His isolation and his fear had. The twins, by anchoring him in the present, describing not only what was, but what. He concluded that seeing wasn't about sight anymore. It was about relationship, about presence, and about the courage to walk with people through the dark and name every color along the way. The transformation in Ethan was about to face its greatest challenge. It began with a whisper, the kind that travels through power corridors and newsrooms long before it surfaces publicly. A journalist named Ila Monroe, known for being sharp, ruthless, and hungry for a story that would pierce any myth, had turned her attention to him. Her article didn't ask questions, it made accusations. The headline was a viral-ready dagger, Tech Titan under street spell. Ethan's assistant placed the tablet on the table before him, her silence more damning than any comment. He activated the screen reader, and the words, delivered in a cold, mechanical voice, struck him harder because of their digital monotony. Ila's piece called the twins performers, vagabonds, and hinted at a disturbing level of emotional grooming. He may be blind, the article concluded, but not everyone around him is innocent. For a full minute, Ethan said nothing. His first thought wasn't anger for himself, but a cold, gripping fear for Koan and Kaio. Would they even understand the calculated cruelty behind those words? Or worse, would they simply expect it? His stomach tightened. He stood up so fast he knocked over his chair and gave a single, frantic order to his driver. Find them, wherever they are. Bring them here now. But it was already too late. By the time Ethan reached the diner, the booth was empty. The boys were gone. The waitress approached him, her voice low with guilt. 2 social workers, she explained, had arrived earlier that morning, escorted by uniformed officers. They said they were acting on a tip about endangered minors. They wouldn't even let the boys finish their meal, she added, her voice cracking. Just said something about protective custody. She paused, then delivered the line that pierced Ethan in a way he wasn't ready for. They didn't fight. They just looked disappointed. Disappointed. Not scared, not surprised, as if they had always known the world wouldn't let something so tender remain untouched for long. Standing in the empty booth, gripping the edge of the table, Ethan realized with a surge of self-loathing that he didn't even know their last names. The helplessness ignited a rage he hadn't felt in years. Not the kind that lashed out, but the kind that smoldered inward, turning guilt into poison. He mobilized his legal teams and private investigators, but bureaucracy, shielded by child protection language, was a fortress. Names were sealed, locations confidential. "We make no exceptions for celebrities," one supervisor told his lawyer coldly. "This isn't about his feelings. It's about protocol." Ethan refused to accept it. He reached deeper, calling in favors from powerful people he hadn't spoken to in years, leveraging the unspoken debts of gratitude and fear the world owed him. "Find them," he repeated, like a prayer to every voice on the line. "I don't care where. I don't care how. Just find them." Eventually, a retired judge returned his call with a name and a location, a bleak, overcrowded shelter 3 neighborhoods away. He was in the car within minutes, Arlo by his side, his fists clenched. The shelter smelled of cheap disinfectant and stale fear. A woman at the desk recognized him, but his expression silenced any attempt at protocol. "Koan and Kaio," he said, his voice a low command. "Where are they?" She pointed toward a hallway. He followed the scent of damp blankets until he heard a familiar soft cough, except it wasn't soft anymore. He found the boys curled together on a thin mattress. Koan sat upright, his arm protectively around his brother, whose forehead glistened with fever. When he heard Ethan's steps, Koan turned, his eyes bloodshot but burning with a flicker of relief. "He's not okay," Cowan said simply. Ethan knelt, pressed a hand gently to Kaio's head and whispered, "I've got you now." He lifted the boy carefully, and with Arlo hovering at his side like a second shadow, he carried him out of the building. No one dared to stop him. At the hospital, the world sped up. Doors opened, and a pediatric specialist was summoned in under 10 minutes. Kaio drifted in and out of consciousness while Cowan refused to leave his side, gripping his brother's hand. The doctor, a silver-haired man with tired eyes, stepped into the hall after his examination. "He has Churg-Strauss syndrome," the doctor said. "It's rare. Most doctors would have missed it." He paused, his gaze meeting Ethan's. "If you hadn't insisted on immediate intervention, he wouldn't have made it through the night." The words landed like thunder. Ethan leaned against the wall, the air leaving his lungs in a sharp exhale. All he heard was, "wouldn't have made it." Hours later, in the quiet of the recovery room, Kaio stirred and opened his eyes. "You came back," he whispered, his voice cracking. Ethan bent down, his own voice low and steady, with the promise that was now the core of his entire being. "Always. I will always come back." He understood now what it meant to truly see. It wasn't about vision. It was about responsibility. It meant not turning away. It meant showing up, even when the world told you to retreat. It happened quietly, in the sterile silence of the hospital chapel, a place Ethan had wandered into in the early morning. He wasn't praying, not in any traditional sense. He was simply being still, open, with Arlo curled loyally by his feet. His thoughts drifted to Kaio, sleeping more soundly now, and to Cowan, fiercely protective, even in rest. And then, just there, behind the impenetrable veil of darkness that had been his world for a decade, something flickered. It wasn't an image or a shape, but a soft, golden and faint pinprick of light, like the memory of sunlight through closed lids. Ethan froze, his entire body tensing. He opened his eyes wide, a useless reflex he hadn't abandoned, but this time it felt different. The flicker repeated, brief and gentle, like a firefly crossing a vast, dark cave. He didn't tell anyone at first. The moment felt too fragile to name, as if speaking it aloud would dissolve it. But it happened again later that day, this time near the window in Kaio's room. As Ethan adjusted his position, a burst of brightness, more present this time, sparked in his field of darkness. He gasped quietly, not wanting to startle the boys, but Kaio noticed anyway. "What is it?" he asked, his voice still weak but alert. "Nothing," Ethan said, unsure if he was lying. Later, as the boys slept, Kaio's words from weeks ago came back to him. "You've been flinching at the sun." He confessed to them the next day. "There's a flicker," he admitted. "Just light. No images, no faces." Cowan, who had been silent, looked up and said, "It's not just light. It's proof you're coming back." Then he added with simple finality, "You were never really blind. You just stopped looking." Ethan called his neurologist, Dr. Valdez, who arrived at the hospital within the hour. "Let's see what your brain has to say about miracles," she joked, though her voice was tinged with caution. After hours of tests, she returned with a folder, her face unreadable. "Well," she began slowly, "the good news is you're not delusional." She grew serious. "There's minimal activity in your occipital cortex, barely a blip, but it's new. Your eyes aren't healed, Ethan. Not even close." He nodded. "It feels like light," he explained. "Like it's behind a door that's slightly cracked." She closed the folder. "It could be psychological, a response to emotional reawakening. The brain's plasticity is still poorly understood." She paused, then lowered her voice. "But I've never seen this kind of shift in someone with your history. It means your blindness may not be as permanent as we thought. Not because of medicine, but because something in you is choosing to reconnect." That word, choosing, lingered in his chest. He realized this light wasn't the cure he might have once hoped for. It was proof of the healing that had already occurred. Months passed. Kaio was stable and healthier than he'd been in years. The flickers of light continued to come and go, unpredictably, but Ethan no longer needed them to. he had embarked on the long, slow legal process to adopt the twins. Their records were sketchy, with no known parents or last names. But Ethan faced the bureaucracy with the same tenacity he once applied to mergers and patents. The day the judge handed him the final decree, declaring them Ko-1 and Kaio-Ro, was the first time he had cried publicly without shame. He moved them out of the sterile penthouse and into a house with wind chimes, laughter and light streaming through every window. It smelled of bread and cinnamon and echoed with music and stories. They planted a tree in the backyard, one each, and named them after stars, because, as Kaio explained, roots should reach the sky too. But Ethan knew his story couldn't end with just them. He knew there were other invisible children out there. And so he founded the Luke Foundation, named after the Latin word for light. It was a center for every child who had been overlooked, who had gifts that didn't fit into classrooms, who needed more than food and shelter. "This place isn't about fixing them," Ethan told his new board. "It's about recognizing they were never broken to begin with." On the foundation's opening day, the press came in full force. The crowd parted as Ethan walked slowly to the podium, Cohen and Kaio on either side, Arlo nestled at his feet. He wore no sunglasses. He stood without notes, his face lifted toward the sun. He let the silence stretch before he spoke, his voice steady. "I know many of you came expecting a story about how I got my sight back," he began, a faint smile on his lips. "But I didn't. Not the way you think. My eyes are still damaged. My world is still mostly dark." A murmur went through the crowd. "But that no longer matters," he continued, his voice clear and strong, "because these two boys didn't cure my eyes. They cured something the eyes were never meant to see. My soul." The applause that followed was soft at first, then grew. Later, Kaio tugged his sleeve. "Did it go okay?" Ethan smiled. "You tell me. What did you feel?" Cohen answered first. "They saw you." That night, in the garden of their new home, he stood with the boys, listening to the wind. "I used to think seeing was about eyes," Ethan said quietly. Kaio nodded. "And letting yourself be found," Cohen added. "Even by yourself." In the soft dark, Ethan saw more than he ever had in daylight. Not with his eyes, but with something far deeper, something healed. Something he now knew was sight. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.